Today we're going to be taking a look at an image by a photographer that goes by FC Racer, and he has a really wonderful travel blog. I wanted to work with this file mainly because it's a Fuji file, and I wanted to play around with the Fuji curves inside of Capture 120. So today we're going to do a quick little demo about how to use layers in Capture One to replicate the same workflow we would do as a master file inside Photoshop. So first thing I'm going to do, this is a raw file from Fujifilm GFX 50R, and when I used to shoot film or chrome, I always used to shoot Estia, and I always loved the look of it, so I wanted to play around with this. So I'm changing the curve under base characteristics to Fuji Estia. You can only access those Fuji curves if you have a Fuji raw file. So first thing I'm going to do is crop. I think this would look much better without this whole area down here in the bottom left. So I'm going to come in, do a crop 16:9, and then I'm just going to come in and pull out that bottom area right there. That gives me a nice look, and then I'm going to go back. So here's the original file, now cropped. And looking at it, you can see there's a lot of haze. So one of the things that I'm going to want to do is come in and start doing my global corrections. Well, rather than just do this on the background, I'm going to come in and use my layers palette. So I'm going to come in, add a layer, and this new layer is going to be completely filled. And by filled, it means completely global. So I'm going to title this Global Luminosity. And actually, before I start messing with that, I'm going to go back to the background. The one thing I am going to do very quickly is white balance. So I'm going to find a spot. First, I want to add a color readout point. And as I mouse over here, I'm looking around and I see 170, 170, 177. So I'm going to put a dropper there. So that tells me just by looking at this that I can see that there is a 7-point blue cast in this image. So from that readout, I'm just going to pick this location to white balance from. And that pulls out that little bit of blue cast, returns us a little bit to more of what I want. In this case, I'm done with that color readout, so I can come in and delete it. There I have it deleted. Now that I have my white balance settled, I'm going to go back to my global luminosity. So here, I'm going to come into my tab to where I can drop down and tweak with the exposure. So since this is luminosity, I'm not really going to be tweaking any color here. I'm just going to be focusing on the overall exposure. And I'm going to bring that up just a little bit. Let's say about there, and I can turn on and off the layer. So yeah, that's about right for that. Now in this case, this haze and fog, I want to tweak with that just a little bit in the foreground. So I will definitely target that a little bit later. As far as other global changes, I'm going to want to come in and do a little bit of highlight work here. Actually want that up about there. I'm going to darken that down just a hint. And coming down here, I'm going to set my black point and white point using my Luma curve. I could also do that with the sliders here of coming in and tweaking this. But I like to do it with Luma curves, so I'm going to come in and just bring this in a little bit. I don't want to bring it too far in because it really starts to pull that. I'd have to do a lot more adjustments in the... Oh, I could do that. Come back up here. It gives it a nice little bit of a mood. So that's pretty much set my black points and white points here. I could also do that with levels if I decided I wanted to affect that. That would also affect color because it's an RGB versus the curve, which is in Luma. So right now I just want to affect the luminosity, so I'm not going to come in and do the levels part yet. Once I have my global luminosity done, I'm going to come in and add another new filled layer and type global color. And here I'm just going to go ahead and affect the overall global color of this image. So I'm going to play with the saturation a little bit. I want to pop these greens just a touch. I'm not going to go too deep into that. Into the the RGB and the levels, I'm going to come in and tweak this just a little bit. Until I get something that I like. And then I can turn that on and off. This is affecting both Luma and color because it's in RGB mode. But it is affecting my global color. I can come back in and check my saturation, make sure that's where I want it. I could go a little bit deeper. And then from here, it's all about doing some local things. And really what I want to do is pop the contrast and clarity in here and clear up some of that haze, illuminate a little bit more in this area up here. So I'm going to end up adding a new mask. I'm just going to come in and say new filled layer. I'm going to title this Forest. And with that active, I'm going to come up and hit Luma Range. And Luma Range, before I do that, I'm going to hit the M key on my keyboard to bring up the mask. I'm going to hit Luma Range. And I'm going to take my Luma Range and tell it what it can and can't hit. So essentially, I'm coming down and I'm just sliding this so that it's mainly hitting this foreground forest. And I can feather that more or less. I think right about there is pretty good. And that gives me a pretty nice mask for what it is that I want to do here. So I'm going to hit apply. I'm going to hit the M key on my keyboard to turn that back off again. And now I'm really going to come in. I'm going to pop the contrast just a little bit. I'm really going to come down to clarity and increase that. And you can see that that starts to get rid of the haze, especially on the left-hand side. I don't want to push it too far though. And then inside of this, I'm going to balance that with a little bit of another levels here. And I don't really want to darken this down too much. So I'm going to grab the middle slider here. Until I get it just how I want it. I'm going to come back in, give me a little bit, very little bit of shadow. And then I'm going to up the contrast a little bit more. And I'm going to click that on and off. So you can see that really darkens that down quite lovely. And then I really want to come in and boost these yellows a little bit. So what I'm going to do is add a new layer here. And I'm going to fill it. I'm going to call this peak. And right now it's global. So I'm going to go ahead and play with some of the color here. And what I really want to do is kind of warm that area up a little bit. Now, I know that this is applying this to the whole image. I'm going to fix that in a minute. Right now I'm just paying attention to this area right in here. So I'm going to adjust this how I want it. I'm going to come back in here, really pop the saturation of that. And then under my mask here, I'm going to come in, don't want to change the name of that. Basically, I'm just going to come in here and affect it with a brush. Turn this on and off again, just make sure I like that. Yeah, it pops that quite well. And I'm going to invert the mask. So now it's all covered. Come back in with my brush, and I'm just going to decrease the size of my brush here. Bring up my palette by hitting Control, tapping. I want to make sure that auto mask is on and use pin pressure is on for me, because I'm actually using a I'm using a Cintiq, and I want my flow really low. And I'm basically just going to come in and paint this in exactly where I want it. And if I want to see where I'm at, I can hit the M key and you can see the mask kind of pop up here. And I can also come over here and display grayscale mask if I want to see exactly where that is. So I'm just going to come in, keep painting here. And since I have my flow at 3%, I have to go over this a whole lot of times if I want it to actually affect this. Now I can turn this on and off. It's subtle, but it does pop that. I'm going to come in and brighten that whole area again just a little bit. And that, there it goes, it redrew. Actually, I'm going to darken it down, put the saturation on more. Yeah, it gives it a nice little pop. Now, the foreground down here in the greens, I can quickly come in with my color editor here and target specific areas. So I can target the greens, and I can come in, I'm going to create a new layer. And target the greens. Play with darkening these a little bit. increasing the saturation a bit. It's a subtle shift. I'll push it a little further. It does a nice little deepening down there. So that gives me a really nice adjustment. I'm going to go back to this peak layer and target my yellows and really kind of pop those a little bit more. And into the oranges. And there we have, if we come in and look at our layers palette, we have the background, global luminosity, global color. I've tweaked the forest, I've tweaked the peak, and I've tweaked the green of the trees. And if you want to essentially see a before and after, you can just come in, turn off all these layers. Here we have the original file, global luminosity, global color, darken down the forest, pop the yellows in the peak, and came in and darkened down the greens. So using layers is really nice because it allows you to turn on and off, toggle things on and off, and keep your adjustments completely separate from part to part. So that way you don't have to go back and reset everything or go find the sliders that you set it on. You can just tap that individual layer and toggle that on and off, or tap that individual layer, see what those settings are, and adjust them as needed. So that's a quick little, very quick little tutorial on how to use layers in a similar way that you would inside of Adobe Photoshop, but using Capture One.